Hi, in this video I'm going to share some memories that I have about collecting music in the 1980s. Of course, this topic has come up many times on this channel. I love to reminisce and think back to the good old days when I was very young and I started to collect music. This would have been back in the 1980s. And as I've mentioned before, at that time I was quite a voracious collector of cassettes and vinyl, and eventually I really got into compact discs. Now, back in those days, and if you lived in the 80s, I think a lot of what I'm about to say is going to sound very familiar to you, especially if you're a diehard music collector like myself, and especially if you have very vivid memories of music in the 1980s and how music was marketed in the 1980s. There were some trends that I really noticed. Even at a very young age, I noticed certain things that kept happening and kept popping up. And that's what I'm going to share in this video. One thing I noticed about music in the 80s, when a band put out an album, often they would try very hard to have at least 3 hit singles. It seemed like 3 was definitely the magic number. Most bands, whether they be big, famous bands that sold millions of records, or even smaller bands, they'd always try to have 3 singles. That was always the magic number. And I found a lot of bands back in the day, they would have one big hit single, and usually the next one and maybe the third one might not have been as good as that first initial big single. That was another thing that I noticed that kept recurring back in those days. And something else I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed this too, a lot of major record labels, they would always put the big hit of the album as the second song on the album. And if you don't believe me, go back into your collection, look at a lot of the big 80s albums from that time. And not all of them did this, but many of them did. The big hit single would always be the second song on the album, or the second song on side 1 if you're talking about cassette or vinyl. I really don't know why they did this, but it is definitely a trend that happened a lot back in those days. If you have any insights into this, if you know why they used to do this, why did it always have to be the second song, please leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And I also noticed, as I mentioned, a lot of times they would try to release 3 hit singles. And often if an album was put out and there was only 1 hit single, chances were very good that that band would not be releasing another album after that one. It just seemed that if the band only generated 1 hit, maybe the record label didn't think they were bankable enough or worthy enough of supporting a follow-up album by that band. And certainly a lot of times back in those days, singles would be released a few months before the actual album. And you'd often buy a 45 single, and somewhere on the album it would say, "From the forthcoming album, blah blah blah," whatever the name of the upcoming album was. That was another big thing that would happen back in those times. From the forthcoming album. It was almost like a sneak peek of the upcoming album. And I also noticed back in those days, and again, keep in mind this was before the internet, really bands almost had to shoot a video for all their singles, and those videos would be in constant rotation. I know in the United States there was MTV. In Canada we had a station called Much Music, and Much Music was basically the Canadian version of MTV. And the hit videos of the day would be played over and over and over, and really be instrumental in driving people to go to their local record store and buy that album by that artist. So yeah, a lot of money was poured into video production, as is still the case. But in terms of promotion, again, there was no internet, so there was no promotion on the internet. Promotion was always done through magazines. And I remember buying a lot of music-related magazines back in those days. Television was huge. And I'm not just talking about MTV or Much Music. There was a lot of entertainment type shows where they would interview bands who would be talking about their latest album. So television, magazines, those were all very, very important in the days before the internet. And of course, radio was huge, very, very huge. Radio could make or break a band without question. And when I think back to some of the shows that were really popular that the bands would appear on to promote their latest album, I think of shows like American Bandstand. American Bandstand was so hugely popular. I never missed it. Every Saturday afternoon I would tune in. You also had shows like Solid Gold, Soul Train, a lot of those types of shows. And of course, often bands would appear on late night shows like The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, Late Night with David Letterman, and Saturday Night Live. Those shows were very instrumental in promoting new bands and new albums. So that's my little look back at some of the trends that I recall back in the 80s. And of course, some of these still happen to this day, but maybe not in exactly the same way, maybe in a slightly different way. It was certainly an exciting time. It was a fun time. And if you remember those days very well, if you're a big time 80s music fan, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, give us a thumbs up, and as always, please subscribe to my channel. Hope to see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.